Hey Diana, so great to catch up with you again. We've been having quite a few chats and conversations around our different areas of speciality and expertise, but particularly around gender-based violence, which is becoming more topical, not only locally, but globally as well because of COVID and the pandemic. But before we jump into that, why don't you let everybody know kind of what you do and your area of expertise, because they may not know what angle you're coming from.
Great, thanks Paula. I'm so glad we got a chance to just catch up and talk a bit more about this subject. It's very important. And my expertise are basically, I'm known as a social media law expert and a child's rights activist, but also in our firm, Diana Schwarz Attorneys, we practice human rights, child rights, and labor law. And with that connection, with the social media, the labor law, and the human and child rights, the gender-based violence has sort of impacted each area of law, and it sort of cuts across each of those areas, especially now that COVID has made the home the workplace. So that's the kind of angle that we are looking at. How do employers, what sort of liabilities do employers have in this regard? What sort of duties do they have, and how do they protect their employees?
Yeah, I think that's how we got to initially getting in touch and working together, is because, with the work that I do, particularly around relationship dynamics, so relationships in the home, relationships in the workplace, conflict management, emotional safety, behavior profiling, that kind of thing. And as you said, because the home has now become the workplace, we're seeing that being impacted and those dynamics now being very blurred. And of course, incidents of domestic abuse or gender-based violence becoming more and more evident in the workplace and in the home. Yes. So one of the things that comes up in conversations is around, particularly from an employer's perspective, the Occupational Health and Safety Act says that an employer has to provide a safe working environment. Now, with the home becoming that working environment, where does that role and responsibility lie? Is it with the employer, or is it with the employee who may be in a toxic environment?
So this is quite a tricky area, and this is where it's very important to note the provisions of OSA. So basically, OSA says in terms of Section 8 that it has to, and every employer must maintain and provide a safe working environment that is not a risk to the health of their employees. So health of employees would then also include mental health as well as physical health. And because the home has become the workplace, and we've seen that with the stats on COVID, the gender-based violence stats and domestic abuse has basically skyrocketed. And here now we have an employer who's sort of going into territory that they haven't been in yet, but they do have a duty to provide support and assistance. So OSA places a duty on employers to provide and maintain that safe working environment, which would then be to provide assistance and support and have proper policies in place to actually ensure that employees are actually safe at home.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that in terms of, working with individuals or couples that are now being forced into a confined space in the home environment, and potentially even if there's children involved as well. If you didn't have a strong foundation or relationship to begin with, and you're now confined in this space, it is definitely causing a lot of friction. There's a lot of conflict. And a lot of couples have been seeking advice around divorce or separation yes. because they've realized that their relationship has not necessarily been as healthy or as stable as they initially thought, because we couldn't escape to go to the office, and run away from it, or potentially sure. avoid dealing with it. And it's now put a spotlight on that. And we're seeing divorce rates spiking both globally and locally as well.
Yes, and I think, in your field, you have more experiencing with counseling and assisting with relationships. So, I would like to just ask you, what are some of the common myths that, people view GBV as? What is actually in terms of our culture in South Africa, there's a lot of different cultures. What are some of the myths that people actually think about GBV?
So I think that the common myth is when we hear gender-based violence or GBV, we automatically associate it with male on female abuse, and we associate it with physical abuse or violent abuse such as sexual abuse and rape. We don't stop to think about the other forms of abuse. So, for example, female on male abuse, because it does happen. And we don't think about children, so abuse with children and human trafficking. We also don't think about the mental and emotional abuse and also financial abuse. And then also other areas in terms of the LGBTQI spectrum. We don't think about abuse that happens in those communities as well. So it's around incorporating, when we talk GBV, we're actually talking abuse. And we're talking abuse of all forms, all shapes, and all levels, and in all communities.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a really wide spectrum that it falls across many different individuals, children as well as adults, same sex, or female on male, like you're saying. And I think it's important that we look also in terms of consolidating a definition around it, because we've then got abuse, we've got sexual harassment, and we've got gender-based violence and harassment, and then gender-based violence. So pretty much it all should fall under the same spectrum. I think also what's quite interesting in terms of a mental health awareness perspective, what do you think corporates should be looking at in terms of, like, what should they do about this? They find themselves in quite new territory, and I think a bit of a scary territory as well.
Yeah, we've never had to deal with something like this before. Corporates initially were focused around sexual harassment or sexual misconduct or bullying in the corporate workspace, and they didn't have to take into account GBV or domestic abuse, because it was something that happened outside of the working hours or the working environment and space. But now with the home being the workplace, they can't ignore that anymore. And so when it comes to how are we relooking our employee well-being initiatives or support structures, we have to look at holistically. Sexual misconduct and harassment and bullying in the workplace, as well as the GBV or domestic abuse, and that's happening in the home, because it is all integrated now. And that's leading to something else that's starting to come out, which you've been dealing with a lot lately, which is around the online or the cyber bullying, the cyber abuse. What's happening in that space?
Very much so. I mean, look, this happens online every single day. I mean, we have issues of sexual harassment online, we have revenge pornography, we have cyberbullying, we have cyber stalking. In fact, some of the stats, for example, with cyber stalking is that it's actually more prevalent than actual physical stalking. And and the internet and online spaces and social media are amazing, and they allow us to connect, and there's so much positivity around it. But you do have sort of an easier access to victims. So often victims, whether they be women or men or young children, will be approached by strangers online or with catfishers who are fake profiles, in an effort to form some sort of relationship, or either harassment that happens. We've had in the last 2 years interesting cases where female journalists were targeted quite a bit on social media as well. So there's so many different aspects that come into play, and it's also something that employers have to be aware of, because within the workplace we also have this online harassment happening. We have sexual harassment emails, or inappropriate behavior on WhatsApp groups, things like that. So it forms part of this spectrum of GBVH and abuse. And it's certainly something that employers also need to include in their policies. And basically, employers have to adequately protect their employees. So if there's an incident online that happens, it's just as important as an actual physical encounter. And if their policies are not in place to actually address that kind of issue, they could land themselves in hot water and become liable to the victim as well for failing to protect them.
I don't think many employers have thought of this. It's a very grey area because we've never been put in this position before. And I think in the initial stages of lockdown, and quite understandably, a lot of corporates were sort of scrambling to get people set up and working from home and being able to operate, and they didn't necessarily think about, you know, the implications of that in terms of systems and processes and policies and protocols. And now a lot of corporates are, if they haven't already, then this is a definite red flag. You need to potentially start relooking your protocols and your policies around these types of incidences and topics.
Definitely. And I think, you know, I think that's why we've decided to team up and do this great collaboration, which I'm so excited about, because we have an opportunity to actually go in and assist corporates with this kind of training and say, from the legal side, this is what we need to be aware of. These are the policies we need to draft or we need to review. And this is basically the implications with regard to that. And then you come in with the wonderful aspect of employee wellness and mental health and how to actually deal with this issue of gender-based violence. And it's really hard because it's a big issue. And you know, I think corporates need that support and they need sort of experts to come in and assist them in this journey that they now have to go through. So I think that's great. And I think that, you know, you and I have also spoken about, you know, what is the root of it? Like, how do we stop this from happening in our country? I mean, we've both said this is a pandemic on its own. So what do you think? How do we actually get to the root of this? And how do we actually stop this from happening? Because from a legal perspective, you know, there's prosecution of perpetrators, there's criminal sanctions, you know, victims can also launch civil claims for damages, etc. But it doesn't seem to be stopping the problem.
Yeah, and I think there's so many elements to this. So my first sort of my passion plea is if we could collectively, as because this is a global issue, GBV is a global issue, just like the pandemic is. So can you imagine the impact that we could have globally if we all came together and put the same amount of effort and energy and attention and resources and focus onto GBV as we currently are with the COVID pandemic? Can you imagine the traction we could make? Imagine if we were monitoring the global rape stats monitor, just like we are monitoring the COVID infection rate globally. And seeing every day whether the rape stats are going up or going down in all the different countries around the world. I mean, just that in itself would be a huge steep, step forward. But it does have, for me, it's a three-pronged approach. One, it starts in the home in terms of how we are raising our boy children, our girl children. And for me personally, I think we've lost the very basics of values and core values in the home. Yes. And that then obviously links into from a community point of view. So things like our churches and forums and places of safety and stuff like that as to what is acceptable and non-acceptable behavior. Right. In the workplace, definitely having those conversations and not, doing it a hush-hush or as and when an incident occurs, then we talk about it, or, so more proactive stance than reactive stance. And then the same from a government level. So from a media point of view, media, and I talk across all media. We need to constantly be talking about this, not waiting until the annual 16 days of activism campaign kicks in and then we do a whole rah, 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 and then we don't talk about it again. Abuse happens every day in our homes, in our communities, in the workplace. So we need to be talking about it every day, just like we are COVID. Yes. And companies need to, from a training and an awareness and an education point of view, and the policies that they're putting in place, and from a government point of view as well. We need to bring our forces together. So many places out there are doing so much good, but they're working in isolation. If we could bring those resources together and pool our resources and our knowledge and our skill sets. So, for example, Lifeline, SADC, rape crisis centers, places of safety, the police, the medical fraternity. If we could come together as a task force and pool our resources, we could have much more impact in terms of eradicating this pandemic.
No, that's absolutely brilliant. I think you've made such good points that are very, very thought-provoking, and it's a much deeper level. It's a community, it's a society, it's different stakeholders, it's private, the private sector, it's government, it's everybody. And I think also in our work with online safety and child's rights activism, we find that it takes a community. It takes a community. We've got amazing organizations. For example, we work with the Film and Publications Board, who do so much with regards to child pornography and removing child sexual abuse imagery and training law enforcement. And there's so many different organizations, like you say, if we just all teamed up. We also work with an amazing anti-human trafficking organization called Hope Prison Foundation. And it's so it's not really helpful when everybody works in silos. And like you say, I think it would be incredible, just really, if we really sat back and thought the effort that we're putting into COVID, if we could put it into this, that would be incredible.
Yeah, and that comes to your area of expertise. We've chatted about a lot of campaigns that focus on GBV, particularly focus on the victim and what their rights are and how to get it to a place of safety, but nobody's talking to the perpetrators. Mm-hmm. Nobody's putting a spotlight on what are the repercussions, what are the rights, what are the circumstances, how do we help? Because if there were no perpetrators, there'd be no victims, right? But we only tend to be focusing on one half of the problem. So I think educating victims and perpetrators in terms of what are the rights and roles and responsibilities and repercussions. And I think that's where you play a large role around educating from a law perspective.
Look, the sad truth is that pretty much when it comes to perpetrators, there are just negative implications. Perpetrators will be prosecuted, they will be charged, they will be probably dismissed in a work environment scenario. And there isn't much, like you say, it's very much focused on the victim and the protection of the victim, which I think to a large extent it should be. However, like you say, we've got to find the root cause of an issue to eradicate it. And there are basically not really many legal rights. I mean, obviously, in terms of our law, every person is entitled to a defense. Mental health may come in as a factor with regard to that defense, your upbringing, what sort of, what state you were in when committing these crimes, etc. And with children, of course, it's a much more of a different ball game, because kids are, they have certain levels of legal liability from 7 upwards. And whether they actually appreciate if they've committed a crime or if somebody under the age of 18 has actually perpetrated, sexual assault or etc., the levels of accountability. So I think it's very much, it's not legislated at the moment in respect of what rights do I have as a perpetrator. However, when it comes to the social media space, it's a little bit more prevalent, I think, where we've had, with a lot of the campaigns that we've seen in the last couple of years, the Me Too campaign, the big scandals, the Jeffrey Epstein, the R. Kelly, all of those type of scandals, we've had the naming and shaming of alleged sexual perpetrators online. And that's caused quite issues. I mean, I've been interviewed on so many different platforms with regard to this. And what happens when somebody falsely accuses a perpetrator, or they name and shame without any sort of formal legal process. And, women especially have found much comfort in going online and feeling sort of a solidarity in this Me Too movement. But what we always advise is that we don't want any victim, whether it's a female or a male, etc., to have a secondary traumatization or victimization, because they are liable in terms of the law. In sexual assault cases, the identity of an alleged perpetrator cannot actually be published by the media or anybody else, or any details of that offense, until the accused has pleaded guilty in court. So a lot of people do not know that, and that actually can lead to charges of obstruction of justice And of course, then the social media offences of crime and injuria, which is the intentional unlawful impairment of a person's dignity, and defamation come into play. So if, for example, a victim goes and names and shames an alleged perpetrator without having followed legal process and law, they can then get themselves into trouble with the law and be charged with these offences.
Yeah, and I suppose on the one hand, it gives you a bit of comfort that there is a process to follow, but
Yes.
on the other hand, it's also, if you don't follow the process, then kind of nothing happens or very little happens. So it may seem, especially from a victim's perspective, you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Very much so. And I think that's what I've struggled with in so many of these interviews, to say, we so sympathize. As a woman myself, I sympathize with women and victims and children. And, I just don't want that victim to suffer any more further sort of trauma or ills, so to say, with naming and shaming. But again, we've seen the positive force of social media and what can happen when, things are exposed on social media. However, I would never, ever advise a victim to name and shame. I would always say, look, you can maybe speak your truth, but don't name the person until we've gotten to that stage. And I think it's sad, because in our country we have incredible laws, but enforcement of those laws is very tricky, and that's where I think we fail. And a lot of victims who experience gender-based violence and harassment don't receive the treatment that they should when they go down to actually going through the legal process. So, but there are a lot of organizations that that can assist and do help victims. And I think what I do advise is go to Power, go to an organization to help you go through that process. Have someone at your side who knows what the SAPS should be doing and how you should be treated in this process.
Yeah. And I think that's where, if we pool our resources together, we can be so much more impactful and effective,
Yes.
and providing an environment for victims to get the help that they need and the rehabilitation that they need, but at the same time for perpetrators to get the help that they need and the rehabilitation that they need to go through to change their behavior. Because I always say, we are not born abusers. We learn how to become abusers based on the environment that we are exposed to. And if you can learn a behavior, you can easily unlearn the behavior just as well. But it is a process, and change takes time. But without that, the correct support structures and the opportunities to rehabilitate, it can be more difficult for change to take place.
100%, Paula. I think you've just hit the nail on the head with that statement. Is, you can unlearn a behavior, and you need support, you need time, you need the proper sort of counseling. But that's how we eradicate it. That's how we get to the root cause. Like you say, if there were no perpetrators, there wouldn't be gender-based violence and harassment. And so I think that's fantastic. I think that is the approach that we should be taking to rehabilitate our perpetrators as well.
Yeah. And that's why I'm so looking forward to the training and the workshops, that we've put together in different formats, because we bring both perspectives into play. And it's about creating that safe space for conversations and dialogue where victims, if need, can put their hand up and say, I need help, I'm a victim, and or perpetrators can put their hand up and go, you know what, I have been abusive, and I've realized the impact that I'm having on that person or persons around me, and I want to change my behavior.
No, I think that's why this training is so valuable, because, when one comes in just from a legal perspective, it can be very sort of, black and white, and this is what the law says, but we always have to include the human element, and that's where you come in. And I think it's so important that we can collaborate on these things and provide a generalist view for our clients and corporates out there. And I hope that we are able to impact and to make a difference, and I think it's always a bigger impact and difference when corporates get involved and, get behind and support these initiatives, because at the end of the day, the employer is the one with the power, and most of the time the employer is the one with the finances to provide that support and assistance to their employees.
And I think it's a great opportunity as well for employers to show how they really care about their employees and the well-being of their employees. And as we've seen, there are some corporates out there that are being very proactive in this space, and that is just so exciting to see that they are taking this stance. And I can't wait for us to see more corporates get on board with us and really take a much more proactive stance to contributing to eradicating GBV.
No, definitely. It's very refreshing to see some of the corporates that we have, we are going to be providing training to, who have done so much work in this area already. And it's really refreshing that they're already thinking in this way. So yeah, we just hope it goes from strength to strength, and we're just able to impact lives with this process for the better and for the, for the health of our entire country, basically.
Yeah. Well, it was awesome chatting to you again on this, and I look forward to seeing you at our next training session.
Awesome, Paula. Thank you so much.